The Las Vegas Raiders find themselves in a unique position heading into the offseason after their final game against the Chargers this Sunday. Why? Because they've got an impressive $108 million in cap space, and let's be honest, the team isn't in bad shape. In fact, if healthy, I believe the Raiders have a top 5 defense. With a few key upgrades on offense, there's no reason they can't compete. Imagine bringing in a top-tier wide receiver, fixing the offensive line, and adding a solid quarterback. That's a team capable of winning 9 to 11 games. Of course, staying healthy is crucial, but there's potential here. Today, I want to focus on 2 players that Raider Nation has been buzzing about, 2 free agents who are likely to move on from their current teams. The first is Trey Smith, a guard for the Kansas City Chiefs, and the second is wide receiver T. Higgins of the Cincinnati Bengals. I'm going to break down why I don't think it makes sense for the Raiders to pursue both of these players. Now, I'll be the first to admit, I'm a huge fan of T. Higgins. If the Raiders bring him in, there's definitely a lot of upside, especially if he's paired with a strong quarterback. He could be the wide receiver one this team needs, but I'll get into why it might not be the best move in just a bit. Let's talk about Trey Smith first. As a fan of offensive linemen, I make it a point to study players in this position, not just from the Raiders, but across the league. I'm always keeping an eye on guys like Samuel Cosby, Kevin Dotson, Landon Dickerson, Robert Hunt, and many others. Trey Smith is a guy I really admire. He was drafted in the 5th round by the Chiefs, partly due to concerns about an injury, but he's proven to be one of the most dominant offensive linemen in the game. But here's the thing. With $108 million in cap space, the Raiders should be strategic about where they spend. Signing a guard to a big contract just doesn't make the most sense. Trey Smith is likely looking at a deal worth around $20 million per year, and that's a lot of money for a guard. Don't get me wrong, Smith is one of the best in the NFL, but I believe you can find top-tier guards without breaking the bank. Take Jackson Paris-Johnson, for example. The Raiders drafted him in the 2nd round, and already he's one of the best centers in the league. If he plays guard, he could be one of the top 5 in just a couple of years. There are always players like this emerging in the draft, and with the right investment, the Raiders can find a high-quality guard without spending a fortune. There are certain players that we just know are going to be good. Take Cooper Beebe from the Dallas Cowboys, for example. Although he plays center now, he was mostly a guard in college, and we all saw he had top 5 potential at that position. Now, he's on track to become one of the best centers in the league. Players like him are a great example of why I believe finding top-tier offensive linemen doesn't have to break the bank. Spending nearly $20 million on a guard just doesn't seem like the best value to me. When you think about positions that impact a game's outcome, the quarterback obviously tops the list. After that, it's probably wide receiver and offensive tackle. Guards, running backs, and tight ends tend to be less critical to a team's success, though of course there are exceptions, like Brock Bowers, who blurs the line between tight end and wide receiver. For the Raiders, it's all about being strategic with that cap space. Imagine drafting a guy like Tyler Smith, a top guard for the Dallas Cowboys. If the Raiders brought him in, they could get 5 dominant years out of him, then extend his contract while he's still young. That's the kind of value you want to look for. Another thing to remember is that just because a player excels in one system doesn't mean he'll automatically thrive in another. Moving to a new team brings new challenges. I'm not saying Trey Smith wouldn't be a top 10 guard if he came to the Raiders, but I just don't think it's the best financial decision for the team. Now let's talk about T. Higgins. I love this guy. I think he'd be a great fit for the Raiders, but we need to keep in mind that he's likely going to command around $30 million. That's a hefty price tag, and if the Raiders sign him, it could mean losing out on other important players. As we head into the offseason, the Raiders have 27 free agents on the table. While the team has $108 million in cap space, a good chunk of that is available because so many key players are set to hit the market. Some of those players are stars in their own right, guys like Robert Spillane, Trayvon Mullen, Nate Hobbs, and Adam Butler. If the Raiders want to bring them back, they'll need to allocate a significant portion of that cap space to re-sign them. Take Nate Hobbs, for example. He's one of the top 10 slot corners in the NFL. Trayvon Mullen is a top 10 safety, and Robert Spillane is a top 10 linebacker. Adam Butler, while older, is still one of the best defensive linemen in the league and could easily command $8 to $10 million per year. These are players the Raiders will need to account for when considering their cap space. Even Malcolm Koonce could be in line for a big payday after his breakout season. Had he gotten a deal last year, he could have easily earned $18 to $20 million. So, when you're considering whether to bring in a high-priced free agent like T. Higgins, it's important to remember that doing so might limit the Raiders' ability to retain some of their own key players. The Vikings paid Jonathan Garrard around $18 million a year, and this season he's become one of the top pass rushers in the NFL. He's an incredible player for the Vikings, and I believe Malcolm Koonce could follow in his footsteps. Now, Malcolm did suffer an ACL injury, so he might not get quite as much as $18 million, but he definitely won't settle for just $3 or $4 million. That's not going to happen. We all saw how well Malcolm played in 2023. He dominated on the field, and so did all the other NFL teams. Every team has scouts and player personnel directors who are watching players like Malcolm. If the Raiders offer him $5 million, you can bet he'll find a team willing to pay him $10 million. Every team would want Malcolm on their roster. If the Raiders want to keep him, they'll need to offer at least $10 million, and even that might be on the low side. Since he's coming back from an injury, a one-year contract could be the best option for him. This way, he can prove himself and aim for a bigger contract next year. Now, if we look at other players like Kayvon Chasen, I'm not sure what his value is, but it's likely less than Malcolm's. He might be looking for around $6 to $8 million. Then there's Isaiah Pacheco, another player to consider. Thinking about these 7 or 8 key players, we're already looking at around $60 million just to keep them on the Raiders. And that's a conservative estimate. If we spend $60 to $65 million on these players, we still have 20 other roster spots to fill. Even at the league minimum of $2 to $3 million, filling those spots could cost around $50 million. So, when you look at the Raiders' budget of $108 million, it doesn't stretch as far as it seems. There are important free agents to consider, and the reality is that the Raiders might not have as much money as we think. Spending $20 million on Trey Smith and $30 million on T. Higgins might not be possible if they want to keep players like Adam Butler, Malcolm Koonce, Robert Spillane, and Trayvon Mullen. Some of these players are replaceable, like Robert Spillane, since linebackers often fit specific schemes. But I believe Trayvon Mullen and Nate Hobbs have a lot of potential ahead of them. They've both shown great development and could be very valuable for the Raiders. As for Adam Butler, he's one of the top pass-rushing defensive tackles in the league. He hasn't had a big contract yet, making around $2.3 million this year, but he could easily command $8 to $10 million on the open market. I was surprised he didn't get that last year, to be honest. I would love for the Raiders to sign T. Higgins, but I'm not sure it's realistic. The same goes for Trey Smith. I think he might not be worth the investment. T. Higgins could be a good value, but paying someone $30 million is a tough call. Some might argue he won't get that much, but I think he'll still land around $20 million. I think people are missing the mark here. Look at Brandon Ayuk and Amon-Ra St. Brown. They both got $30 million. T. Higgins is just as good as they are. If you don't believe me, consider Jalen Waddle, who got $28 million, and DJ Moore, who also got a big deal. Honestly, T. Higgins is better than both of them. Plus, T. Higgins is a true X wide receiver. There aren't many players like him who can handle double coverage, play the X position, and block effectively. Sure, you could draft someone like Tytyro McMillan, who stands around 6 feet 4 inches or 6 feet 5 inches and fits the X wide receiver mold, but that would mean using a high pick, like the 7th or 8th overall, on him. I'm not against that idea. It could really benefit the Raiders. They could also consider bringing in Jalen Moreno-Cropper, who just declared for the NFL draft, in the 2nd or 3rd round. The Raiders need to figure out their strategy as we head into the offseason. I do wonder, though, how much money we're spending on free agents from other teams instead of investing in our own homegrown talent who have already proven themselves. Speaking of homegrown talent, let's talk about Patrick Graham, our defensive coordinator. He's been doing an amazing job for the Raiders. During a recent press conference, a reporter praised him, but Patrick quickly pointed out that we haven't won enough games. He believes the Raiders deserve better. I truly think Patrick Graham is one of the best defensive coordinators in the NFL. While Brian Flores gets a lot of credit for the Vikings' success, it's important to remember that they have a solid quarterback and a good offensive coordinator. The Raiders, on the other hand, have struggled with their offensive coordinator and quarterback this season. If we had a strong offense, people would recognize Patrick Graham's talent even more. Of course, we also needed our key players, like Malcolm Koonce, Christian Wilkins, and Max Crosby, to stay healthy throughout the year. What Patrick Graham has accomplished with our defense this season has been impressive. When the Raiders brought him in from the New York Giants, I reached out to a friend who covers the Giants. He told me that Patrick is one of the smartest minds in football. In his first year with us, the defense didn't improve much, but in his second and especially his third year, you can really see the difference. I've come to realize that Patrick Graham is the real deal. He's a top-notch defensive coordinator. Of course, for a defense to shine, the offense needs to be consistent and avoid turnovers. I wouldn't be surprised if Patrick Graham gets some head coaching opportunities in the upcoming hiring cycle. In fact, the Raiders might be at risk of losing him, especially since he could attract interest from teams looking for a head coach. Last year, he had some interviews, including one with the Seahawks, but they ended up hiring Mike McDonald from the Baltimore Ravens. This year, I expect more teams to consider him, especially since several teams will be looking for new head coaches. There are about 6 teams that need a head coach, and while only one will likely hire Ben Johnson, the rest will be eyeing candidates like Patrick Graham and other successful offensive coordinators. There's also a rumor I heard recently that I want to touch on. Patrick Graham didn't sign a contract extension with the Raiders. For those who might not know, when coaches sign contracts, they're usually guaranteed. So, if a coach signs a 3-year deal and gets fired the next day, they still get paid for those 3 years. Some people are wondering why Patrick Graham didn't sign an extension last year. This is his final year with the Raiders, and it raises questions. I've talked to some knowledgeable folks about this, and some believe he might be considering other job opportunities. If Antonio Pierce stays on as head coach for another year, but the situation isn't right, like if we don't have a winning quarterback, then it might not make sense for Patrick Graham to stick around. Instead, he could look to join someone like Ben Johnson, who just got the head coaching job with the Chicago Bears, and run that defense. By not signing the extension, he keeps his options open. It's similar to what Vic Fangio did when he left the Miami Dolphins to coach the Philadelphia Eagles. He realized that the Eagles offered a better situation for him. I hope that doesn't happen with Patrick Graham, but it's definitely a possibility. If he does leave and Antonio Pierce stays, the Raiders would need to find both a new defensive coordinator and an offensive coordinator since Antonio doesn't call plays. We'll just have to wait and see how things unfold. Now let's wrap this up by talking about the Raiders' Pro Bowlers. Brock Bowers and Max Crosby have both been named to the 2025 Pro Bowl games. A big shout out to these two players. Brock Bowers truly deserves this recognition after having an outstanding season as a tight end. He's leading all tight ends in key statistics and is also at the top among rookies. Honestly, I'd be shocked if he doesn't win Offensive Rookie of the Year this season. He's had a remarkable year, which is rare for a player in his position. Malik Neighbors is also having a fantastic season and deserves a shout-out for being the best wide receiver from last year's draft class. But in my opinion, Brock Bowers has really earned this honor, especially considering he's performed well despite having multiple quarterbacks throughout the season. As for Max Crosby, he ranked 5th in votes for his position, which is impressive, but there were 4 other players who some felt deserved it more. I can understand that, especially since Max has missed a few games recently. However, he had a great year leading up to that point, so it's great to see him in the Pro Bowl. If there's one player I think the Raiders should have had in the Pro Bowl, it's Robert Spillane. He's had a solid year with tackles and interceptions on the defensive side, and has been a true leader for the team. Even though I mentioned earlier that the Raiders might consider moving on from him, I still see his value, and would love for the Raiders to bring him back. A.J. Cole also deserves some recognition. I think the Raiders may have punted less this year due to all the turnovers, but he's been a solid player. Jackson P. Johnson is another player who I believe deserved a spot in the Pro Bowl. We also need to acknowledge some really talented interior offensive linemen. Cam Jurgens made his first Pro Bowl this year, and I'm a big fan of his. He came out of Nebraska, or Wisconsin, and ended up with the Eagles. Jason Kelce even picked him as his potential replacement, which says a lot about his talent. Jurgens has been phenomenal in his first year as a starting center. I think Jackson P. Johnson is one of the top 2 or 3 centers in the league right now, alongside Cam Jurgens and Creed Humphrey. I believe he'll have a good shot at making the Pro Bowl next year. So, what do you all think? Give me a thumbs up, subscribe, and I'll see you next time with another video. Feel free to share the next section when you're ready.